Hi, welcome to an introduction to philosophy where we explore some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we're going to be looking at the question, what is the meaning of life? Now, this sort of question really goes to the heart of why people study philosophy, I think. There's lots of different questions, and there's lots of different ways that philosophers address and answer this question. But in this video, we're going to be taking a look at how Nietzsche's philosophy of existence provides a model for thinking about how our lives can be meaningful or not. So what is the meaning of life, right? It's sort of interesting because I think that most people consider this to be the perennial question in philosophy. That is the core question of why we should do philosophy at all. And I've left this question up to we haven't even addressed or asked this question throughout the entire semester until now. And I think so, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a philosophical movement known as existentialism, or to be more particular, I'm going to introduce to you the general concept of existentialism, and then we're going to step back and look at one of the prototypical philosophical positions for existentialism, and that would be the philosophy of existence as embodied by Friedrich Nietzsche. So welcome back, everyone. This is our video on Nietzsche. So welcome. So I want to start with this question, which is, what is existentialism and what do we mean by that? And to be clear here, existentialism was a 20th century philosophical and literary movement that came to prominence in Europe, particularly in France, although there were philosophers from all different nations and cultures who wrote existentialist types of philosophy. We'll also see that actually one of the earliest existentialist philosophers, though he didn't use that term to describe himself, was Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, there is a history to existentialism, which is namely in the 19th century the work of both Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche really helped to pave the way for the existentialist thought that would follow. And so to be clear, typically we don't call Kierkegaard or Nietzsche an existentialist, at least with regards to the movement the movement of the 20th century, but we do refer to both of these thinkers as having a philosophy of existence, and we'll talk about why that's important. Ultimately, I think that we can say here that Soren Kierkegaard, sometimes referred to as the father of existentialist philosophy, was actually a Christian Danish thinker. And so he actually sort of spearheads what's known later as Christian existentialism, though Marcel Jaspers later would also contribute to that field. Friedrich Nietzsche, I should say, was a German philosopher who is certainly an atheist, and he provides something of the prototype for the atheist existentialist philosophies that would really I think, take center stage within the 20th century. So these two thinkers are incredibly important. And today we're going to be focusing on Nietzsche, although I have to say that Kierkegaard is equally as rich and his thought is equally thought-provoking. And so I encourage you to look at both of these thinkers. In the 20th century, these are the thinkers who are typically thought of as existentialist or existentialist philosophers. On the one hand, there's a philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger, who really is a fabulous thinker, and in fact, I think probably one of the two most important philosophers in the entire 20th century. We're not going to be talking about his philosophy today, but you can see he has we can say this, is that Nietzsche's work had a tremendous influence on Heidegger's development, I think. Though ultimately Heidegger has a pretty stark criticism of Nietzsche's work. He sees Nietzsche as the last person doing metaphysics, and after Nietzsche, Heidegger doesn't think that metaphysics is possible anymore and should be abandoned, essentially, in favor of the question of being. So we won't go into all of that, but I think by the end of today's session, you'll probably get a sense for why Heidegger would think of Nietzsche here as the last metaphysician. Probably the most famous existentialist who thought of himself as an existentialist here was Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre was a French philosopher, and his sort of principal existentialist philosophy comes in the form of his book Being and Nothingness. Although his Existentialism is a Humanism is a pretty important text as well. In fact, I've included that text in your readings if you're taking this course with me. For those of you that aren't taking this course with me, a great place to begin any study in existentialism is to read Sartre's essay, Existentialism is the Humanism. You can easily get it online. Just Google it and you should find it. Albert Camus is another important philosopher and literary figure. He's probably more famous for his book The Stranger than he is for anything else. If you haven't read The Stranger, you really ought to read it. It's a great study in the analysis of alienation, I think, ultimately. There's also Marcel Jaspers, who we might say is a Christian existentialist, or at least he sort of advocates that position. There's many other existentialist thinkers, and we'll see here, though this video isn't going to be diving into existentialism per se, not in terms of its 20th century iteration, but we can say that phenomenology plays a very important role within the development of existentialist philosophy. Now, those are just some of the key thinkers, but let's think about what exactly is the philosophical definition of existentialism. And here's what I want to say, is that quite simply we can say that existentialism is the philosophical position that holds that existence precedes essence. That is, existence is logically prior and fundamental to essence, right? Let's sort of see if we can go here. What do I mean? Let's first just review what we mean by existence and what we mean by essence. Existence, of course, refers to that something is, right? So as an example, we can take my cell phone here, my iPhone, and we can say that my iPhone has existence, meaning when I say it exists, I'm saying that it has being, right? I'm saying that it is. The essence, by contrast, refers to what something is, right? And here I want you to think about, go all the way back to Plato and think about Plato's discussion of the forms, right? Plato thinks that the forms are what are the essence of all of the things that exist in the world, right? Remember, Plato divides the world into being and becoming. And being is where the forms exist, and being and these forms have certain specific perfect essences. All of the things that exist in the realm of becoming, by contrast, are imperfect in the sense that they only partially exhibit the essence that's in the forms. And it may be worth going back and watching my lecture on Plato here, and Plato's theory of the forms, to give you a more robust sense of what I mean by here. And I think I even make the distinction between essence and existence in that lecture. So, and in terms of classical philosophy, existence was seen as accidental to essence. So the classical view, when I say the classical view, I pretty much mean every philosophical position up until at least Kant. But there the idea was that existence was just accidental to essence. So what really mattered, what is central in philosophy, was essence. And I'm using this term logical priority. So you could say that in the classical view, essence had the logical priority. Now, what do I mean by logical priority? Well, I don't mean priority in time. That would be temporal priority, right? So for instance, before one event can occur, another event has to occur to cause it, right? That would be a temporal priority, for instance. But we might say that the logical priority is when we talk about something being more fundamental, or in other words, other things are dependent on that thing. So a good example of this is, think about a house, a brick house, and think about the cornerstone at the one of the corners of the building. At the very bottom there should be a stone, or at least some sort of foundation, that functions to actually hold all of the weight of a specific post in the building, right? The cornerstone has logical priority as compared to the roof, for instance, right? Because even though the roof is here and the cornerstone's here, even though they both exist simultaneously, the cornerstone is more fundamental. Because you can get rid of the roof and keep the cornerstone, but if you get rid of the cornerstone, the roof will collapse. So this is what I mean by logical priority. So for instance, think about a human being that exists in the world, right? What would the classical view be? Well, the classical view is that the human being, and think here about the idea that Plato's forms are determinative. Maybe zoom in here on what I'm talking about in terms of the classical view. The idea is that the forms are determinative, right? So for Plato, my humanness right, is dependent upon the form or the essence of what perfect humanness is, right? And it's because I participate in that form that I can say I'm human. So that means that my existence is derived from the essence that exists in this ideal transcendental realm of the forms, at least according to Plato. So for Plato, the essence has the logical priority and not existence. And he had good reason to think this, right? Because, for instance, even when I die, right, even if you destroy my existence, one can still retain knowledge of the essence, right? So one can still know what a human is, even when all of the humans around them have been destroyed, right? So that looks like existence is sort of secondary. It's accidental. It's not necessary to understanding or knowledge as such. So that means that when we ask the question, what is the meaning of life? The classical view is that the meaning of one's life or existence depended upon the essence that one could gain knowledge of. So here, think about Aristotle's eudaimonia. In a previous video here, we isolated Aristotle's notion of happiness, eudaimonia, right? Also translated as human flourishing, as the, at least for Aristotle, as the natural telos towards which all persons are directed, the natural goal that we're all after. Now, for Aristotle, he thinks this is essential to human nature, right? Such that every human being is essentially organized such that they're after eudaimonia or happiness. They're searching for it in their lives, and so Aristotle thought that the ethics could be a science of right action to ultimately help us understand how best to achieve that happiness, right? But there, the whole idea is that the meaning of one's life is dependent upon the essence of eudaimonia, and ultimately how well or how poorly we are able to achieve it, right? So that means that I can look back at the end of my life and say, from Aristotle's perspective, all people are try to flourish. How did I measure up to flourishing, right? So my existence needs to be compared with the essence of eudaimonia, the essence of happiness, in order for me to make a correct judgment of my life, right? So this is sort of the classical view, but we're going to see here that the existentialist, and I know it's hard to see this arrow, but the existentialist reverses that priority. So for the existentialist, existence determines essence. That is, how I exist in the world is the determining factor for what it is I say is essential to my life. So that means that the meaning of my life, or the essence, is forged through an existing state of affairs or an existing form of life. So that means existence precedes essence, even though they both exist simultaneously. Now, what does that mean? Let me try and see if I can give you a real-life example that'll help you understand what I mean when I say that existence precedes essence. Think, for instance, about an example I often use is think about the debate that people have. Sorry, for some reason my webcam keeps focusing in and out, so I apologize if that's distracting. But think about, for instance, the debate that people have regarding whether or not homosexuality is natural, right? Surely you've discussed this or thought about this issue, or at least heard others discuss whether or not homosexuality, that is the practice of engaging in erotic relations with someone from the same sex, right, is that natural or right or morally justified, right? Well, there's two different ways to see the position, right? Think about, for instance, and let's take the position from the person who argues that homosexuality is natural, right? In the sense that people say there's a gene, right, a gay gene, such that because I have a certain genetic marker in my DNA, right, therefore I am naturally predisposed towards homosexuality or heterosexuality, one or the other, right? So the idea here is that sexuality is defined by our genome or something like this. This is an argument that you hear, for instance, many people make who want to argue in favor of the expansion of homosexual rights. Now let's think about it for a moment. What is that view? The view is that since I have a gay gene, I should not be judged for being, I should not be judged negatively for being gay, right? That's the argument. But notice that that really is actually an essentialist argument, right? Because in that view, the idea here is that I have a certain sort of essence, a certain genome, and my existence is dependent upon that, right? So in that view, in that sort of argument, essence precedes existence, right? And you can see why people would want to argue that. They would want to argue that because I have an essential nature, right? I'm heterosexual or homosexual essentially. Therefore, my existing state of affairs, my actual relations, either heterosexual or homosexual, are not my fault, right? It's not up to me, right? The argument here is ultimately deterministic in nature, right? By contrast, those who argue that God created human beings to be straight and homosexuals are immoral, they also are utilizing an essentialist paradigm. Because there they want to say that God created a certain essence for human beings, and therefore there's a certain form of existence that's acceptable. So we have essentialist arguments on both sides of the fence when we talk about, for instance, gay marriage or gay rights. But what would the existentialist view be? The existentialist view would be really the reverse, because there the idea is existence precedes essence, or existence determines essence, such that I exist in a certain way in the world, right? I am either gay or I'm straight or I'm bisexual or something else, right? And that my form of existence is actually what's telling me or reviewing what's essential to me or what's essential about me. It reveals my meaning. So what does this mean, though? It means that the existentialists would not feel comfortable with this idea that God created everyone to be straight and therefore the homosexuals are immoral. An existentialist would not agree with that argument, nor would the existentialists agree with the idea that there's a gay gene that makes me gay. The existentialist view is, no, you've chosen to exist in such and such a way, and that is what is determining or articulating what the essence or the meaning of your life is. So what does that mean, though, as a consequence? It means that when we talk about meaning, for the existentialist, meaning is ungrounded, or that is, it's not predetermined, right? There's nothing that we can look to except our own form of existence to articulate what the meaning of our life should be, right? The existentialist cannot look at the Bible and say the Bible provides meaning for my life, right? Nor can the existentialist say that the evolutionary biology can provide meaning for my life. The existentialist rather says, I exist, and my existence is precisely what is providing the meaning for my life. But that means that I have no resources other than myself. And so you end up with this idea that existentialism tends to focus very much on the individual as opposed to the collective or the social group. And it's also the idea that meaning's ungrounded, but it's also pluralistic. Because there are many different types or forms of existence, that means there can be multiple types of meaning possible, right? That's what I mean by pluralistic. It means that there is no one answer to the question. There's rather as many answers to the question as there are beings that exist, right? So existentialism essentially takes this sort of the sort of impulse that I think people have philosophically to answer the question, what's the meaning of my life? And it turns it up on its head and says, no, wait a second. You are already in the situation of creating meaning. So here's another way you can think about existentialism. It's the idea that meaning is forged. It's not discovered. It's created. It's crafted. It's forged. It's not discovered. Right? So the question, if we ask, what is the meaning of life, and we take this existentialist perspective, we're not looking to try to gain knowledge about something, right? We're not going to be trying to figure out, like Aristotle does, what is universal and necessary to human beings as such. It's not a question of knowledge. It becomes a question of action itself. So, and we're going to see here that Nietzsche's philosophy embodies this view, this notion that existence precedes essence. Now, the existentialism as such, we're going to sort of push to the side. We're not going to be talking about that so much, though I think I'll return to it at the end here. We're going to be looking at Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche gives us a philosophy of existence, and so I've sort of provided here a brief summary of his life and some of the key works that he published in his life, although many of the things that Nietzsche wrote were not published until after his death, notably by his sister. So he lived from 1844 to 1900, and he was born in Prussia to a Lutheran minister. So Nietzsche is well acquainted with Protestant Christianity as a form of religious life. And in many ways, that, of course, must have functioned as a pivotal element in the development of his thought, at least in a negative sense, because you're going to see that he really issues a very, very stern and harsh criticism of Christianity in particular, but ultimately to any essentialist view, we'll see. In 1869, Nietzsche, at the ripe old age of 24, was actually appointed professor of classical, oh, there's a mistake there, not classical philosophy, classical philology at the University of Basel. And I'm sorry, philology, not philosophy. So it's important here to remember that Nietzsche, even though today he's remembered as a remarkably important and central philosopher of the 19th century, Nietzsche was never, he was only a professor for 10 years of philology and never of philosophy. And so in many ways, he's iconoclastic, because we'll see he's iconoclastic in multiple ways. And when I say he's an iconoclast, that means he's like a bull in a china shop. He has no reverence for anything sacred, intellectually speaking, right? And he's going to go in philology and really sort of begin to knock, the glass menageries to the floor and really start breaking things up. And he's going to do the same thing in terms of moral philosophy as well. And some of the important things, his first book, which was published in 1872, was called The Birth of Tragedy. And The Birth of Tragedy, we'll talk a little bit about it up here in a couple slides from now. But The Birth of Tragedy was a really important text in philology, it's a really important text in philosophy. When it was published but it was published as philology. And when it was published, it virtually doomed Nietzsche's career as a philologist. Up until, you can see at the age of 24, he was appointed as a full professor at the university before he even finished his doctoral degree. And that's because other philologists saw Nietzsche as this sort of rising star. But after the book is published, his colleagues in the philology departments in Prussia and Germany ultimately rejected his arguments as just ludicrous. And as a result, he really had a sort of, I don't know if the word's poor, but he had an unfortunate career as an academic, at least. Because in 1879, he would resign his post at the university. In fact, if you go back, we can go back and look to see how many students he had. And after The Birth of Tragedy is published, the amount of students that would be willing to even take Nietzsche's courses dropped to single digits. And so he was ostracized essentially in his career for this book that he published. So he resigns, and then he actually sort of continues to write furiously. He wrote a lot of things. Didn't publish all of those things, but he does publish in 1883 Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is something of an allegory for his philosophy. In 1886, he publishes Beyond Good and Evil. In 1887, he publishes The Gay Science and On the Genealogy of Morality. You're going to see that today we're going to principally focus on the genealogy of morality, although I'm going to give you sort of a spattering of Nietzschean concepts that I think are necessary, at least to get a sort of snapshot of what Nietzsche's up to in his work. In 1888, he publishes Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and other texts. And in 1889, tragically, or famously, I should say, it's a famous tragedy, I guess, he collapsed in Turin. He actually was in his apartment, and he looked down and he saw someone beating a horse. He walked down and started screaming and talking to the horse, and then eventually collapsed. After that point, for roughly 10 years, or at least until 1900, 11 years, Nietzsche essentially was in almost a catatonic state, barely spoke, and he lived with his mother and his sister until his death. Now, he's famous because Nietzsche went insane in the last years of his life, and then didn't write anything and barely spoke. And there's been lots of debate about whether or not his philosophy made him go insane or his insanity was the result of syphilis that many scholars believe he likely contracted while visiting, living, and writing in Italy, probably from prostitution. But that's unknown. We really don't know if he died of syphilis, but that would explain his madness ultimately in the latter part of his years. Speaking of, there's a great movie for those of you who watch Netflix on Nietzsche's death called The Horse from Turin, which is about the whole thing. So it's a sort of interesting, provocative movie. You might want to take a look at it. So that's a little bit about who Nietzsche was. And in the end of his life, he really just wrote by himself. He was publishing clearly, but he wasn't involved per se in the academic world. Now, I want to go back. I mentioned that he was a philologist, and I want to go back and talk a little bit about philology. Philology refers to what is philology? Philology is the study of word history. And the reason this is important is because you're going to see that I think Nietzsche effectively uses philology as a method of doing philosophical investigation. That is, he probes the use and the use of our language, the use of our words, in order to help understand how our moral systems and our values have evolved over time. But to talk a little bit about philology for a moment, philology, I want to say a little bit about philology in the Renaissance. I did it again, that says philosophy. I think the computer must have been automatically correcting the spell checker was correcting it. It should say philology in the Renaissance. Well, in the Renaissance, philology became a very important way, a very important exercise in scholarship. And what do I mean by this? That is, I want to tell you a story about a thing called the Donation of Constantine. Here's a pictorial representation of it. Now, the Donation of Constantine in the Middle Ages was a document that basically had been signed by Constantine, who was one of the last great emperors of the Roman Empire, though not the last. But that there was a document that the church had in which Constantine donated resources and a charge to the church, the Catholic Church, in order to maintain the imperial order. Right? And essentially the Donation of Constantine throughout the Middle Ages was used as the chief justification for where the church derived its authority to use the military, right? Because in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a military it would use to enforce order throughout, I guess you might say, the European Christian North. And the Donation of Constantine was essentially a document that said, listen, Constantine, the former emperor of the Roman Empire, gave the church the power and the charge to do such. And so that became essentially the legal justification for why the church had the authority to do what it did in terms of military might. But here's what occurred, is that when in the Renaissance, philologists, these are sort of free academic thinkers, began to analyze these documents. And what they discovered was that the language it was written in, literally the grammar that the Donation of Constantine was written in, was hundreds of years off, meaning that it would have been impossible for Constantine to have signed it because Latin wasn't even spoken in that manner. And so what that meant is they were able to prove that the Donation of Constantine was a forgery. And as such, that ultimately was one of the sort of one of the key elements that ultimately destabilizes the church's power and leads to the Reformation and so on and so forth. And so you can see that philology played a very important role, right? A very important role in terms of the development and the analysis of history, right? So that's why philology is so important in the 19th century, and why all these universities have philology departments. There are still philology departments, but they're nowhere near as populous as they once were. Now, in Nietzsche's day, in the 19th century, philology is one of these chief academic disciplines. And so what's Nietzsche's chief question philologically? Right? That's sort of hard to say 10 times, right? Well, his chief question essentially concerns morality and our values. That is, where do our values come from? And where is all of these things we believe in terms of our moral values? Where do these things come from? And he wants to trace out an answer to that question philologically. Right. Now, in The Birth of Tragedy, for instance, and I'm not going to really talk much about this, but in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche articulates two dichotomous values in Greek tragedy. That is, he says, listen, in order to understand a Greek tragedy, we have to understand that there's two sorts of value systems at play and in tension within Greek tragedy. The first is the Apollonian, which is the ordered and the rational, right? But there's another, it's the Dionysian. The Dionysian, Dionysius was the god of wine, for instance. And so here, the Dionysian refers to this idea that things are disordered and done out of passion and emotion, right? And what he wants to argue is that we've spent far too much time thinking about Greek tragedy in terms of the Apollonian, but in order to give a full account, we have to understand the tension between the two. And so this is essentially what The Birth of Tragedy is about. But it really sets the tone for Nietzsche's career in philosophy, because ultimately Nietzsche will continue, I think, to sort of come back to this question, not of Greek tragedy, but come back to this question of always sort of articulating that we place too much emphasis on this Apollonian and not in terms of the that which is not captured through this sort of kind of clean, neat reasoning processes that we like to employ, right? And in the genealogy of morality, which is what we're going to really focus on in today's lecture, the question is really aptly put, which is, where do our values come from? And I want to read you here the preface, the first preface to Nietzsche's genealogy of morality. He writes, "We are unknown to ourselves, we knowers, and with good reason. We've never looked for ourselves, so how do we ever suppose to find ourselves? How right is the saying, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Our treasure is where the hives of knowledge are. As born winged insects and intellectual honey-gatherers, we are constantly making for them, concerned at heart with only one thing, to bring something home." Right? I'll pause there for a moment. What he's arguing there is that we don't really know who we are. We are unknown to ourselves, and we're constantly addicted to knowledge. We want to go find out knowledge and bring it home, like insects gathering pollen to make honey, right? But he says, as far as the rest of life is concerned, the so-called experiences, who of us has enough seriousness for them or enough time? I feel we've never really been with it in such matters. Our heart simply is not in it, and not even our ear. On the contrary, like somebody divinely absent-minded and sunk in his own thoughts, who the 12 strokes at midday have just boomed in his ears, wakes with the start and wonders what hour has struck. Sometimes we too afterwards rub our ears and ask, astonished, taken back, what do we actually experience? And or even, who are we in fact? And afterwards, as I said, we count all 12 reverberating strokes of our experience, of our life, of our being. Notice he says being, existence. And lose count. We remain strange to ourselves out of necessity. We do not understand ourselves. We must confusedly mistake who we are. The motto, everyone is furthest from himself, applies to us forever. We are not knowers when it comes to ourselves. Now, I love this passage for a couple of reasons. One, it perfectly exemplifies Nietzsche's writing style, which is beautiful. Unlike many philosophers who write technical and sort of dryly, Nietzsche writes with a poet's spirit. And so, number one, it's well written. But number two, it really articulates this dichotomy I was trying to articulate between essence and existence earlier, right? We're men of knowledge, he says. We're after knowledge. We want to bring it home. That's the idea, that we want to find what's essential about our lives and bring it home in order to understand our experiences, right? These so-called experiences of our lives. But you can see here, we don't take our experiences seriously. We don't have time. We don't even have the ear to talk about it or hear about it. So what does that mean? It means that our experiences, our existence as such, our being, is left in the dark, whereas because we're only and solely concerned with knowledge. So you can see here this distinction between essence and existence. And here, of course, he wants to say is that we have to understand our existence, right? And he wants to ultimately argue that we're going to have to gain knowledge in terms of the development of our moral systems to understand who we are. So let's start with our experiences and describe our experiences to see if we can come to knowledge about ourselves ultimately. Right, so he's reversing the traditional priority between knowledge and experience. Okay, so the next thing I want to mention here is the death of God. And this is the death of God. Nietzsche's very famous for saying that God is dead. And I want to read you one of his important books here is The Gay Science. Although he talks about the death of God in multiple texts, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what is the death of God? This is an aphorism. Now, Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms. What's an aphorism? An aphorism is essentially, it's like a parable. It's essentially a narrative or a story that has a philosophical point that you have to figure out. So it's something like a philosophical puzzle in the form of a narrative, right? So think of it very similar to as a sort of parable. And so he gives these aphorisms. Now, by the way, one of the things I like about the use of aphorisms in Nietzsche here is that because you can even see this sort of discussion between experience and knowledge, or existence and essence here, with the very notion or the use of an aphorism. Because normally philosophers, like for instance Aquinas, they just tell you what they think, right? Remember when we read the arguments for God's existence? Aquinas just spells it out very, very clearly, right? But with an aphorism, it's not spelled out. You are ultimately required to make sense of it, right? That is, your understanding has to exist in such a way to make meaning of it, right? And so there's a nice parallel between the classification of existentialism and Nietzsche's very approach in terms of how he writes his philosophy. So let me read you this aphorism 125. The madman. Haven't you heard of that madman who in the bright morning lit a lantern and ran around the marketplace crying incessantly, "I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God." Now hold on, pause. Notice here this madman's running around crazy. In the early morning hours, there's actually light, it's actually sunlight outside, but with a lantern, right? You don't need a lantern in the early morning lit hours, right? But here he goes, it's bright and yet there's a lantern. And since many of those who did not believe in God were standing around together just then, he caused great laughter. Has he been lost? Then asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone to sea and emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed, one interrupting the other. So there, notice that Nietzsche is talking. His madman is actually asking where God is to the atheist. Nietzsche's not addressing Christians here. He's addressing the atheist. So the madman jumped into their midst and pierced him with his eyes. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you. We have killed him. You and I. We are all his murderers. But how do we do this? How are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Who are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling, and backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we straying as through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing in upon us? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning? Do we still hear nothing of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we still smell nothing of divine decompositions? Gods too decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How can we console ourselves? The murderer of all murderers. And it keeps going, but I want to stop there. And the question is, what I want you to see here is a couple things. One is that here we have this notion that, number one is that I guess Nietzsche is an atheist, which means that he doesn't really believe that God was alive in the first place. So God wasn't killed per se. So what we have here is we have an allegory. So what's the meaning of the allegory? Well, let's see. Let's move here. Well, the first thing here is that what are the consequences of the death of God? The first consequence is that there's no moral guarantor, right? There's no being who rests in that Archimedean point, like Descartes hypothesized, who can guarantee that our understanding of how we ought to act is actually true or justified. So there's no guarantee anymore. And if there's no God, there's no pre-established essence either, right? So there's no pre-established essence. Now, if there's no pre-established essence, that means there's no objective meaning and there's no intrinsic value to our lives, right? We aren't born with meaning, objectively speaking. We're not born with an essence of how we ought to live. And there's no guarantee that we are living the right way, right? And notice here, of course, I mentioned when I was reading the passage is that Nietzsche's talking to the atheist. And so the idea here is that Nietzsche wants to argue that, at least regarding his contemporaries, that even though these atheists, or the atheist doesn't believe in God's existence, they still want to argue that there is a way in which we can have a guarantee of moral value, that we can have an essence, that there is a meaning to our lives even though there is no God. And Nietzsche just doesn't think that follows. Without God, we end up with an epistemological perspectivism. That is, since there's no objective meaning, all knowledge is based upon one's perspective. There's no Archimedean point. There's no objective knowledge that we can somehow gain. All things that are known are gained through and within one's perspective. So that means that the limit of my knowledge corresponds to the limit of my perspective, right? And that applies equally both to knowledge as well as it does to moral. It applies to, I guess, sort of material knowledge as well as to moral knowledge, right? So, and Nietzsche's famous as holding a certain sort of perspectivism. Now, what does this mean ultimately? That if there's no God to guarantee our values, then aren't we in a state of nihilism? So what is nihilism? Well, nihilism is this idea that the life in the world is ultimately meaningless, that there is no meaning to the world and to our lives, right? Now, there's two responses to the problem of nihilism, and Nietzsche refers to his own philosophy as nihilistic. Now, there's two types of nihilism. On the one hand, we might say that there's passive nihilism, what Nietzsche calls European Buddhism, though I don't think he fully, at least in my view, I don't think he fully understands Buddhism. But he calls it European Buddhism. But passive nihilism really refers to our reaction to the discovery that our lives are meaningless. And the answer is one, passive nihilism is just to sort of wither up and give up, right? Is that since there can be no meaning in the world, then I should slowly retract myself from involvement in the world, right? This is the notion of passive nihilism, right? There's a great philosopher, well, I already mentioned him, Albert Camus, right, who wrote The Stranger. He wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, and I'll mention it here at the end. But in that book, he famously begins the book by saying there's only one real philosophical question, and that's whether or not you should commit suicide, whether or not life is even worth living, right? And the idea is that when we realize our lives are groundless, right, there is no essence that undergirds us, right, the guarantees that we're living in the right way, well, a form of passive nihilism would be suicide, for instance. But on the other hand, there's active nihilism. And active nihilism is when the response to this is namely, well, I will just make my own. I will make my meaning. I will make my life meaningful, and I'll make my own values. And they're transitory, yes. They won't last after my death, okay, right? But even my life may not have an essential meaning, but it will have some meaning. I will make meaning in terms of how I exist. And so we have a passive and an active nihilism, and Nietzsche here advocates a sort of active nihilism. Now, he doesn't use that language of passive and active nihilism, but I think it's quite helpful in understanding Nietzsche's prerogative, ultimately. Now, I want to mention something here regarding what I call Nietzsche's psychology. And there's a lot of debate about this, and so I guess I take a certain position on how I interpret Nietzsche. And he has a central concept. He has a book actually called The Will to Power. Let's see here, I have it here. The Will to Power. And he talks about, and early commentators thought the will to power was a cosmological principle. I don't see it that way. I see the will to power as a human psychological principle. For instance, in his book, The Antichrist, from 1888, we get this passage from Nietzsche. He says, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome." And here the idea is that all human beings have a sort of natural instinctual drive a natural instinctual drive that we could call the will to power. And the idea here is that we literally try, through our forms of existence, we will our own power into the world. Right? You might even call this sort of an egoistic psychological view. And in fact, many ethicists precisely refer to Nietzsche here as an egoist. And so the idea here is that all human beings naturally strive to have their way, right? To have their will empowered in the world, right? And so this is central to Nietzsche, right? Now I want to call this. I don't think this is an essentialist philosophy, right? Because for Nietzsche, the will to power, I see it as an instinctual sort of drive. I see it as a psychological concept. In fact, it's interesting because in the early years, Freud, who of course is the father of psychology, was accused by psychoanalysts. I think at the 1911 Psychoanalyst Convention. I could be wrong on the date, but I think that was the year. Freud was accused of essentially duplicating Nietzsche's philosophy in his psychology, right? Freud has a number of different principles, the pleasure principle, for instance, and so on and so forth, right? But the will to power here, I think we can see it as a psychological principle, such that all human beings do this. Now, not all human beings do it well, and human beings may sublimate their will to power. That is, they may let other things sort of take the place of the satisfaction of will, or the empowerment of the will. But all of us want this, right? And here, there seems to be something just descriptively true about this, right? I have children, and my children, especially my daughter, right? She has a very strong will to power, right? She's trying to make the world conform to her will. And I'm trying to make her conform to my will, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be something true about this. Now, there's one other really important psychological principle that I think exists within Nietzsche's work, and that's his notion and his discussion of the herd instinct. Nietzsche views human beings like cattle to some degree, such that human beings naturally herd around each other. That is, we adopt the values and the beliefs and the views and the actions of those who are around us. And here, this is just true descriptively by our own experience, right? Human beings naturally, for instance, there's been many, many psychological experiments to show that human beings will naturally do what they see others doing around them. For instance, there was a great experiment in which they asked students, it was like graduate students or something for the psychological experiment. They asked students in this university to come and take a survey, to come in this room and do this sort of survey that they were doing for a psychological experiment. Now, the survey they were doing had nothing to do with the real experiment. The real experiment was to see to what extent people would subordinate themselves and do what other people did around them. That is, how many people would just conform to the crowd. And what they did is, while the person's taking the test, they literally started venting smoke into the room as if there was a fire. But all the other people in the room who are in on the experiment, right? Because there's only one person they're actually testing. but this person's in a room with a whole bunch of other people. But all these other people would just sit still and ignore the smoke. And the majority of persons tested would also ignore the smoke when the people around them ignored it. Even when it became so smoky that they couldn't even see before their face, if other people remained in the room, typically they would as well. And so what we've discovered is that human beings naturally essentially adopt the value system and the forms of action that those around them have, right? And this is, right, where we sort of just do what the crowd does, right? And so there's this sort of natural herd instinct. And so we have a will to power where we naturally want to empower our will into the world, but we also have a natural instinct to do what others around us do, to conform to others. And you can imagine there's probably important evolutionary biology reasons for both of these things, right? Now, to be important here, Nietzsche talks about this, but Nietzsche does not really give, I think, sufficient evidence to prove all of this stuff. So he talks a lot about it. So I think it is a philosophy. It's not a science. It's not a psychology. Okay, so keep those in mind. The will to power and the herd instinct. Pretty important stuff. We'll see. Because when we talk about the genealogy of morality with Nietzsche, we discover that there's really two different moral systems that exist. Now, in the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche goes back in time, if you will. And he goes back in time and says, let's think about the moral system that existed, for instance, in ancient Rome. Right? And the moral system back then was very, very different from the moral system we enjoy today, or at least that Nietzsche identifies with as the 19th century moral European system. Now, master morality can be understood as having really two distinct values. On the one hand, the value of things of good, and on the other hand, the value of bad. And what is good? Well, in order to understand master morality, we have to go back to the will to power. And we can say that what's good for the master is when the will to power is satisfied, right? And what's bad for the master is when the will of the master is frustrated. That is, when the master doesn't get his way or her way, then the master considers that thing to be bad, right? And to give you an example of this, there was an ancient practice in Rome regarding when children would be born to a lord or a master. And this is what would happen. So, for instance, and there's a great book that describes this on Augustus Caesar. I think it's just called Augustus. So read that book. It's a great sort of biography of Augustus that gives this as an example, for instance. But in ancient Rome, right, when a child was born to a master, there was actually a sort of ritual of rite. And what this ritual was is that the mother or the mother or a servant or someone else would come and bring the child to the master. And the master would have two choices. Either the master could stand up and grab the child and hug the child, and that would symbolize that the master accepted the child, and then the child can grow, and so on and so forth. But the master had another choice. That is, the master could stand up and walk out and reject the child. And if the master did that, then the child would be usually abandoned outside the city gates and left to die. Now, in our society, people who abandon their children are usually considered criminals and certainly considered immoral, I think, typically. But you can see here in ancient Rome, this isn't the case. What's good is when the master gets his way, and what's bad is when the master's will is frustrated. So if the master doesn't want the child, and the master wants to kill the child, then that scene is good, right? Because it's all dependent upon the master's will. Now, by contrast, Nietzsche says that over time, a new moral system would develop, and he calls this slave morality. And slave morality consists rather in a distinction between good and evil, where what's good is when the will to power is subordinated to God, right? That is, when I give my will and let the gods decide, right? I let something more, an essence of some sort, decide for me. And what's evil is when I do my own thing, when I get my way, right? And think here about, and of course, Nietzsche says that the slave morality begins with ressentiment, or resentment. And he thinks that what happens is the slaves in ancient Rome slowly begin. They have cruel hatred towards the master. And why would they have cruel hatred? Is because the master does whatever they want, right? The slave's will is always frustrated, right? And so he thinks what happens is that slowly, ultimately through Christianity, through Jesus Christ in particular, right? In a moment of resentment and hatred, right? The slaves give birth creatively to a new moral system. And the moral system says that one should subordinate their will towards God if they want to be good, and if not, they were evil. And so what that means is that for the enslaved morality, what's evil is what we consider good for the master, and what's good is what the master considered bad. So literally, if we put these two together, we see that in these two moral systems here, they're the inverse of each other. What's good for the master is evil for the slave. And what's bad for the master is good for the slave. And so they invert each other. And essentially, the genealogy of morality tells the story of how these two moral systems bifurcate, and then slowly the slave morality really just takes over and eclipses master morality entirely, right? Especially, think about this, is that there's far more slaves in ancient Rome than there were masters. And so slave morality spreads like wildfire up until the point that you get to someone like Constantine, who has to literally make Christianity the official religion of Rome in order to maintain order, right? So eventually slave morality becomes the official moral system of the Roman Empire, against the pagan oligarchs of the time. And eventually it completely eclipses, after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the church and the history of the Middle Ages and so forth. By the time you get to the 19th century in Germany, right, with Lutheranism, remember Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran minister, you get this idea that master morality is all but gone, right? It's virtually disappeared. And so what this means is that if we go back to the other things we've mentioned, that without an objective guarantor for meaning, the traditional moral values that the people in Europe believe in, they no longer have an objective basis, right? Because slave morality worked precisely by making God the essence or the guarantor for value. And the will has to subordinate itself accordingly. But if you get rid of God, that disappears. Now, obviously in the 19th century, people still believed in God's existence. I mean, people still believe in God's existence today, right? But in Europe, which is primarily secular and atheistic today, in the 19th century, Europe was still very much Christian. But his idea here is, now notice we go back in The Death of God, Nietzsche's talking to the atheist, right? The atheist who subscribes to traditional moral values demonstrates a herd instinct in morality by consequence. And for instance, consider 19th century capitalism, right? In capitalism, and Nietzsche was a pretty large critic of capitalism. And take a look at the video on Marx to get a sense of capitalism, or at least Marx's critique of capitalism, which comes after Nietzsche, or actually it comes around the same time, but independent of Nietzsche. But there's some interesting sort of parallels. Though they're very different, and I wouldn't call Marx an existentialist. But capitalism really contradicts the traditional moral values, right? Consider, for instance, in the Middle Ages, before capitalism, for instance, Christians were not allowed to charge interest on each other. If you gave a loan to someone, there was no interest. Why? Because that wasn't considered charity, right? Someone needs a loan because they are impoverished, and so if you want to help them charitably, you don't try to make money off them. And so in the Middle Ages, that meant that Jews who were not Christians could lend money. And so there's a sort of history of Jewry in Christian Europe, for instance, that you could look at here. But think about it, that the core of capitalism is the idea of making profit. That is, and you only make profit by selling your products for more than they're actually worth, right? And so that means that you see in the rise of capitalism in the 19th century reveals a disparity between essence and existence, where you have a culture that exists, right, by essentially ignoring these traditional moral values, and it's actually extraordinarily productive. But the essence, so that's how people exist, but yet people maintain the essence of Christian moral values. And it's similar to this idea that people go to church on Sunday and then cheat each other economically Monday through Saturday, right? It doesn't make sense. The sense of the idea of God is essential, and the actual manner of existence, there's a total disparity, right? Now, we won't go into it. There's obviously lots of intricate things we could say here, but I hope you can see that from Nietzsche's perspective, the consequence here is that the slave morality is a sort of reveals a sort of emptiness that exists within 19th century Europe, and I think he would argue still exists today, right? So let's move on here. So what does this mean? Well, Nietzsche finally has this concept of the Übermensch. And the Übermensch, Über in German means over, or super, Mensch means man. So the Übermensch is literally translated as the overman. And we see in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Übermensch is mentioned as the goal for humanity. But what is the Übermensch? Well, the Übermensch are those beings who can rise above the herd and create their own moral values, right? They create new moral values. That is, the Übermensch Nietzsche is thought of as as future beings, humans, who would reinstate a sort of master morality, right? And he gives examples like Caesar and Napoleon. And here I have a little picture here from a very famous painting by David, which is called The Coronation of Napoleon. And that's when Napoleon was crowned. Now, in the Middle Ages, when someone was crowned, who would actually do the crowning? Who would literally put the crown on someone's head? It would be the Pope or the Bishop or a Cardinal or someone. Someone from the church, because the idea was that God was granting power to the king. But Napoleon here actually picked up the crown and crowned himself, right? You can see there's the bishop to the side there, but there's Napoleon literally doing the crowning, right? Napoleon is one of these masters who comes in and creates a new moral value system, right? He just, like a bull in a china shop, he just destroys, he doesn't care, and he just takes over. And what happens is the Übermensch rises up with a new moral system, and the rest of the other people around essentially congregate around them, right, and absorb like a herd, using that herd instinct again, and essentially adopt those moral values. And so another example here was Caesar. You can think about Caesar marches his soldiers across the Rubicon, right? There was this notion that no emperor, or there was no emperors, right, but that no proconsul would ever march Roman soldiers into the city of Rome, right, to militarize it, to take over. It had never happened, but Caesar doesn't care about tradition. He doesn't care about the moral values of his day, and he marches his soldiers past the Rubicon right into downtown Rome and takes over and declares himself dictator, or later we would get the word dictator. So both Caesar and Napoleon function as these Übermensch. And Nietzsche thinks that this is not only the goal for humanity, but there will be future beings who will be Übermensch, and the rest of us will congregate around them in terms of our moral values, right? So you get this notion of the Übermensch. So you can see here, or we might say that the Übermensch is a return of the will to power into prominence, right? So again, this is, and by the way, Nietzsche, the Übermensch, I'm giving you sort of a smattering. We focused on the genealogy of morality in terms of what I assigned for you to read, but all these different things are all over Nietzsche's work, right? There's no systematic account of Nietzsche's work by Nietzsche per se. So I'm just giving you these different ideas. Now I want to end today. I'm already over an hour here, and I hope you're enjoying this. But I want to end here with the eternal return, and I want to. In the eternal return is this idea, right? The eternal return is the idea that if the universe is only finite in size, that is, there's only so much of the universe, and the universe is infinite in time, that is, the universe will go on indefinitely, then that means that all things that have happened will happen again, right? Because there's only, if the universe is finite, there's only so many combinations, right? Think in terms of the atomic particles. There's only so many combinations for things to happen. But if there's a finite set of combinations but an infinite time span, then those combinations will continually reappear. And so the idea here is that everything that has happened will happen again. That is, everything will return eternally, over and over. Now, early commentators in the 20th century who read Nietzsche viewed this as a cosmological theory. They literally thought that Nietzsche was arguing that this was exactly what happens in the universe, the cosmos. I don't read it like that, personally, and I would encourage you not to interpret it as a cosmological theory, because there's no evidence that that's the case, right? It could very well be the case that, today we think that the universe is finite in size, but it's expanding in size. But I'm not convinced that that doesn't mean the universe is infinite in terms of its temporal size. Anyway, I won't go into that. So I don't think it's a cosmological theory. I think it's an existentialist test. That is, it's a way that we can reveal what the meaning for our lives is, right, in terms of how we exist. Now, I want to step back here. I mentioned Camus in the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus was this ancient Greek myth or parable in which Sisyphus, for reasons I won't go into, was exiled for all eternity to roll a stone up a hill and let it fall, and then roll it up the hill, and to do it over and over and over again. An utterly meaningless task. Now, of course, the myth of Sisyphus, or Camus' analysis of it is, this is a meaningless task that he says eventually Sisyphus would create meaning for. Eventually become meaningful for Sisyphus despite its absurdity. And there Camus wants to also articulate that the idea that our lives are equally absurd. Even though we're not rolling stones up the hill, our lives are fairly repetitive, like Sisyphus. We're all in a Sisyphean paradox, right? Consider it. Most of us, most of you are taking this course, or you're taking a course like this, right? If you're watching it online, you're not in the course. If you're watching it, you're taking these things because you want to get a good degree, to get a job, and so forth. But what do most people do with their jobs once they get their degrees? Well, they go to work Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. or something, and they're going to do it day in and day out, day in and day out. And at some point, you, with almost virtually no doubt, will come to question whether or not your life is meaningful because it's so just repetitive. Right? Think about it. You're going to go to work day in, day out, day in, day out. You'll get the weekends off, and you'll just do this over and over and over. You'll accumulate wealth, right? You'll get retirement money. And then eventually you'll retire, and then guess what? They'll find someone else to take your place to go the day in and day out. They don't really need you. They'll just replace you, right? And then you'll be retired or something, and you'll just go and play bingo day in, day out, right? And then eventually you're going to die, right? So quite literally, where is the meaning in a life like that when most of us actually live lives like that? Think about it. It's a real question. What does it mean? Now, let's go back to Now, the idea here is that the existentialist ultimately wants you to realize that your life is absurd, actually. That it's based upon a sort of absurdity. There is no essence that you can discover or depend upon to give meaning for your life. You have to make your life meaningful in the very context of this absurdity. Now, go back to the eternal return. The eternal return is this idea that everything that happens will happen again. So let me ask you this, and here's where we can conclude our session in this video. What if I told you that everything that you have done in your life up to this point, you will repeat endlessly forever, like Sisyphus? What if I told you that you're going to have to go out with that boyfriend you didn't like, right? You're going to have to break up with your girlfriend. You're going to have to watch someone in your family die, right? You're going to have happy days. You're going to have bad days, but all of those are going to repeat it endlessly forever. No changes. Just the same thing over and over again. Think about it. What if I told you that that's what the afterlife was? How would you respond? And therein lies the existential test. If I giving you this notion of the eternal return, if you're terrified and you think that would be horrible, a nightmare, then the question is, why are you living that life now? That's the existential test. Because if you think that your life retrospectively wouldn't have meaning if it was just this endless cycle and loop, then the question is, why are you existing like that now? Because you are creating that life. So if you want a different life, then you should go live a different life. You should exist in a different manner. How many of us are taking this course or taking other courses or doing our jobs, et cetera, and we're doing them because everyone expects us to do them? How many of us are living a life that's really just symptomatic of the herd instinct? We just do what others tell us is meaningful. If that's the case, then I think what you may discover, that one day at least, that your life doesn't have the meaning you thought it did. And of course, if you answer, yes, I would want to repeat that cycle of my life, then there you are on the cusp of the Übermensch. For your life is meaningful in its present mode of existence. Right? That's the notion of the eternal return. And it's an existential test that really, I think, really makes us question seriously the nature of our lives and whether or not they're meaningful. So, is there an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? I think that after looking at Nietzsche here and looking at other existentialists, we'd have to conclude that, well, that the project of meaning is a project for oneself. There is no answer I can give, or anyone else for that matter. You must not just discover it, you must create it. And that's the notion of existentialism. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys online. Bye.